Well, today we're pleased to welcome to the studio, all the way from London, Kristy Grant-Hart, who recently published a piece in the FCPA blog called ISO 37001, Why Wouldn't You Certify Your Anti-Bribery Program? So Kristy, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you a few follow-up questions from the piece.
Absolutely.
Terrific. So you say that this standard matches the expectations of U.S., U.K., German, Canadian, and other prosecutorial authorities throughout the world. Mm-hmm. Those are pretty strong words. So maybe a little bit about the standard, what it does and what it doesn't do, and how it meets those prosecutorial expectations.
Sure. So the ISO 37001 standard was developed with people throughout the world. So there were delegates who are anti-bribery experts, people in business, people from the consulting world, people from all over, who came together over the course of a couple of years to develop an international standard that was for business. Okay. So the idea is that there is one global standard that businesses, regardless of size, can live up to. So there's a baseline that says this is what's expected of a good anti-bribery management system.
Okay.
And the reason that it's international in nature is not only because it was developed by people from 50 plus countries who are experts in this. When they were developing it, they were looking at the expectations of the federal sentencing guidelines and of the UK Adequate Procedures Defense under the Bribery Act, and looking at the settlement agreements that have been coming out from the DOJ and the SEC. And when you look at the standard and its pieces, it falls well within all the expectations of what you'd expect to see. Okay. So there are things like expectations around training and training high-risk people in your organizations and potentially third parties. And it's interestingly developed because there are must and shall elements, and there are should elements and may. So what you come up with is a really well-developed standard that says, okay, a good anti-bribery system has to have these elements. And it should have some of the rest of them. But altogether, it comes up with something that is really able to determine whether or not you've got a good program going and what it should look like when you do.
So is the prosecutorial expectation the part that you reviewed and sort of embraced some best practices that are reflected in these different laws and representations into the standard?
Right. So when you look at deferred prosecution agreements, or you look at settlement documents where they've had like VimpelCom or one of the more recent ones, where there's basically enumerated expectations for what the company is to do in order to fulfill its requirements by the prosecutors. Okay. That's a pretty good indication of what they expect or what a good program looks like. And I think that it tells companies when you pull that into this standard, if you meet these expectations, then you likely have a system that would be credited, or at least that would have all of the hallmarks of a good program and the capacity to at least minimize the risk that the company will have for bribery.
So for an organization that has a robust, documented compliance program with all the processes, do you think this standard is helpful for them, or do you think it's more applicable to, let's say, their supply chain?
I think it's applicable to both.
Okay.
My expectation and hope is that it becomes a best practice to have the certification, that it's shorthand for we've invested in this, it's important to us, we pay attention to it, it's something we're continually getting better at, because ISO standards, of course, aren't flat things that just happen. They are an expectation that you will continue to grow and get better in your program year on year. So I think that for companies that already have a developed program, it's a really good way to do a gut check, essentially. Like, have we really got this right? And in the process of preparing for certification, looking at your training program, looking at your tone from the top and how that manifests in messaging to your employees, looking at what your due diligence processes are, what's your risk-based approach for your third parties, etc. That when you're evaluating that against all the facets of the standard, you can really say, yeah, we have done a good job. And I think that companies with already developed programs will likely pass very quickly, frankly. And those that don't have a benchmark to say, okay, what do we need to do to get where we're going? And that the suppliers in particular, the agents, the representatives to large multinational companies, that those companies' compliance officers and procurement departments can take great comfort in the fact that their suppliers who have obtained certification for a reason.
Sure. I could definitely see that as being a robust part of a supply chain network, right? That we're only issuing these subcontracts to certified companies.
Absolutely.
So how does a company obtain an ISO 37001 certification? How does that work?
Well, the first thing that has to happen is that the final one is issued, the final standard.
Okay.
So as of this filming, the final standard hasn't yet come out, but we've had a draft one for some time. We expect the final one to be very similar because we know what expectations are around compliance and around the bribery standard. So once we have that, then companies will be able to either engage a consultant or to look at the standard by themselves and to say, okay, what's it require? And then hire a certification company to do that.
What type of time are we talking about in terms of the investment a company would have to make to sort of stand up a program or to make sure that they would be compliant, and then the actual certification process itself?
I think it really depends on the size of the company and the maturity of the program that already exists. If you're starting from scratch, I mean, I've started compliance programs from scratch before, and that takes a year usually to get it sort of moving. If you already have an anti-bribery system in place, you've already got some training, you've already got some due diligence, processes going, and you've already been looking at your vendors and suppliers, I think it'd be a fairly quick process. You could just make sure you have all of your documentation in place. We have a checklist available at my company at Spark Compliance Consulting, where you can just ask us for a checklist of the materials that you should have in place, and we'll provide that for you. So if you have a robust program, the actual certification period usually takes between 2 days for a small organization and 5 days for a large one, with anywhere between 1 and 3 auditors, really looking to make sure that that what you're doing is working and that it's proportionate and appropriate. But I don't want people to get the sense that it's an impossible standard or that no one will pass or that everyone will pass.
Right.
I think that it's really important that we follow the spirit of the standard, that it can be a global standard that can be certified to, and that it is appropriate and positive to do so.
And is there a monitoring or auditing process that's part of the standard? And is it mandated?
There is absolutely a monitoring and auditing internally that's required. So you have to have a robust audit program for your internal anti-bribery management system, so that you are talking to senior managers or top managers, as it's called in the standard, and making sure that you're continually progressing. In terms of external verification, we would recommend it on an annual basis, taking a look at it. The certification that we're going to provide will be a 2-year certification period, and then after 2 years will need to be reevaluated to see if you continue to meet the requirements of the standard.
And you talked a little bit about this in your article. Are you concerned that this may sort of lead too much to that least common denominator, where an organization would say, you know what, maybe we should just follow the standard and do no more? Because if this is the recognized standard, do we really need to put our resources into going way above it?
Right. I think that I don't think that that's a valid criticism. I do understand this sort of, it'll just be a tick-the-box mentality, but if you look at how the standard is actually written, it covers all the things you would expect. So while I suppose you can have world-class, fantastic training that is done, I don't know, by a circus clown or something where the entire group is like, wow, this is amazing, versus having sort of, 5-minute burst trainings of less interesting material. I think the fact that you're getting the training is the important part, and resources being invested in the program is a requirement to get the certification. So if you pull all the resources out or you don't do enough, you wouldn't be able to get it to begin with. So while it is, I suppose, possible that there is a least common denominator statement where there is a bottom line, but that bottom line is pretty high. And secondarily, particularly in other parts of the world, my former life, I was in charge of 65 countries, compliance in 65 countries on 5 continents. And in most other places, it's just not developed like it is in the United States and the UK, and to a certain extent in Europe. So I think that some of this criticism perhaps comes from people who haven't been working in those places where compliance is still extraordinarily not understood. And actually saying to someone, here's what you need to do, here's your checklist, here are the areas that are important, is incredibly helpful. Because me telling them, the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines require, what is that? I'm not from the U.S., this is not what I do. But ISO standards, because of their applicability for manufacturing and operation systems and so many other areas, my my experience is that companies know what that is.
Sure.
They trust it, they understand it, and this is another way that they can understand they've done what they need to do to give themselves protection.
So what you're saying is the chances of it lowering the water level in sort of the more developed countries with anti-bribery laws is very low, but the chances of it raising the water level outside those areas there's a lot of upside there.
And that's why I'm so excited about it.
Sure.
Genuinely, I think that this is a fantastic leveler. And when I was at the C5 conference in London this past June, the SEC and DOJ representatives were asked about it. And obviously it was in their personal capacities, not representing the organizations. But they both said anything that tells companies what's expected and what they should do and gives a level playing field, that's good. We should encourage that in business. And I think that there's an understanding, perhaps a little bit, that it's not an esoteric thing that we do.
Right.
Anti-bribery isn't some, magical thing where we have to divine it from the tea leaves. There is a way to do it, and that there is an accepted practice and best practice, and that's what ISO's going for.
So if someone says, okay, that sounds interesting, Kristy, help.
Right.
what would you provide?
Well, Spark Compliance Consulting we can do both sides of the fence. We can either help you to develop your program and look at it to tell you if we think you'll be ready to pass, or we have people on the other side that are doing certifications as well. So you can't have both sides. We can't do both for you.
Sure.
But if you have a developed program, you're ready to have it certified, we can do that for you. If you're not sure if you're ready and you want to make sure that you are going to pass and you want to have consulting about that, we can do that as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when is the standard being published formally?
Oh, they keep moving it. We believe it's going to be now in the beginning of October. Originally, it was the end of 2015, then it was going to, or 2016, then it was going to be September. Now we think it's October. But once the final one is available, we're really looking forward to the opportunity to, frankly, help people to get where they need to go so they can be certified and confident that this is for them.
Sounds wonderful.
Thanks.
Well, we'll look forward to talking more about it in October.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.